Hello, welcome back to the History Sphere. My name is Greg. I am your host. What you're about to hear is part 6 of a multi-part series on the decline and fall of the Soviet Union. If you haven't heard the first 5 episodes, I suggest you go back and listen to those now, otherwise you might be missing some of the context for today's episode. Last week we covered Joseph Stalin's consolidation of power, the collectivization of the peasants, and the Great Purge. This week, I'm going to cover some of the series of events that led to the outbreak of the Second World War from the Soviet perspective. This is The End of History, Part 6. In the early morning hours of April 4th, 1940, villagers in Katyn, a small village near the Russian city of Smolensk, heard the sound of truck engines and repeated gunshots. The noises went on throughout the day and into the evening. They would continue the next day, and for many days in the following weeks. Thoroughly subdued by years of collectivization and purges, the villages knew better than to ask questions about what was happening in the nearby forest, but they knew enough to know it wasn't good. In fact, what was happening was a portion of the mass execution of Polish officer prisoners of war and civilian political prisoners that would come to be known as the Katyn Forest Massacre. In April and May 1940, approximately 22,000 such prisoners were executed on the orders of Stalin's regime, as the policies of the Great Purge were extended into the newly acquired territory of eastern Poland. Those executed in the Katyn Forest Massacre, including about 14,000 senior Polish military officers and 8,000 lawyers, intellectuals, and other members of the intelligentsia classified as counter-revolutionary, had been deemed a potential threat, and Stalin signed off on the mass execution in March 1940. It is well known that in September 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland, initiating the Second World War. It is perhaps somewhat less well known that a few weeks prior to the start of the war, Hitler had secured his eastern flank by concluding a pact with Stalin and the Soviet Union, known to history as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, after the two foreign ministers that negotiated and concluded it. The details of this agreement included mutual military non-aggression and economic cooperation, as well as a secret, more sinister portion that divided Eastern Europe into Nazi and Soviet spheres of influence. Within these spheres, neither would oppose the other's expansion or military aggression. In practice, this amounted to partition, with each party swallowing up the sovereign nations that laid between them. When Hitler invaded Poland at the start of September, Stalin waited cautiously to see how the invasion played out. When it became clear not only that Germany was winning, but that France and the United Kingdom, who had declared war on Germany on September 3rd in defense of Poland, were going to do very little to stop them, Stalin's Red Army sprang to action. They poured across the border into Poland on September 17, 1939. Those elements of the Polish army that remained to guard the eastern border put up fierce but doomed resistance. Outnumbered, outgunned, and abandoned by their allies, Poland was overrun. The seizure of eastern Poland by the Soviet Union was permanent. The same territory today makes up the western portions of Belarus and Ukraine. Crucially, Poland's allies, France and the United Kingdom, did not declare war on the Soviet Union. They already had their hands full with Germany. The accord between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union surprised most political observers in both countries and around the world. There were probably no two countries in the world more predisposed to hostility toward one another. Soviet foreign policy in the 1920s had looked to Germany as the likely next domino to fall in the world communist revolution. It was a fully industrialized country with a large proletarian underclass, not to mention being the birthplace of Karl Marx. Indeed, back in 1918 and 1919, as Germany collapsed in defeat at the end of the First World War, communists in Germany had attempted to replicate the Russian Revolution and establish a Sovietized socialist republic in Germany. Though this effort was thwarted by the German political center with the establishment of the interwar Weimar Republic, the left wing of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Trotsky in particular, held out hope through most of the 1920s that the revolution would soon spread to Germany. By the early 1930s, democracy was weakening in Germany. The economic conditions of the Great Depression had driven many into the arms of extremists on the right and the left. The Communist Party was strengthened by this polarization, but so too was a new party on the political right, The Nazis. Officially the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the name should not fool you. The Nazis were a reactionary, ultranationalist, and fiercely anti-communist movement. Since this is not a podcast about the Nazis or the origins of World War II, I'm not going to go into great detail on the subject, but I do think it necessary for our purposes to spend just a few minutes on it. If you're looking for a more comprehensive look at the Nazis, who they were and what they stood for, I recommend The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich by William L. Shirer. It's one of my sources for this week's episode, and even though it's slightly dated, it was written in 1960, I still think it's the gold standard when it comes to the history of the Nazi Party. The leader of the Nazis, as you probably know, was Adolf Hitler. The rise of the Nazis was largely fueled by resentment about the 1919 Treaty of Versailles, which ended World War I. The treaty imposed harsh conditions on the defeated Germans. They were forced to accept guilt for starting the war, an accusation that bears little resemblance to the facts of how World War I actually started, and to pay reparations to the victorious Allied powers. Germany also lost a great deal of territory following World War I, and their military was completely neutered. They were limited to an army of 100,000 and denied the right to even have an air force. This humiliation cut deep for German nationalists like Hitler. Originally from Austria, Hitler had served in the German army of World War I on the Western Front. He was deeply angered by Germany's humiliation. In his view, Germany's proud military had not been vanquished in the field, but stabbed in the back by malicious saboteurs at home. Hitler focused his rage particularly at those groups who he saw as responsible for this stab in the back: Jews and communists. Hitler made little distinction between the communist ideology and the Jewish identity, seeing communism simply as a pernicious plot by a secret cabal of Jews to destroy the great Germanic nations of Europe from within. To support this idea, Hitler pointed to the disproportionate representation of Jews in the Bolshevik movement in Russia. In fact, this particular theory was not invented by Hitler and the Nazis, but rather by the anti-Semitic propaganda of the white movement during the Russian Civil War, which sought to seize on the pre-existing anti-Semitism in Russian society and turn it to their advantage. White and later Nazi propaganda greatly exaggerated the Jewish presence among the communists, and even accused those communist leaders who were not Jewish of being secret Jews. It is true that Jews were disproportionately represented in the Bolshevik and later Communist Party of the Soviet Union when compared to Jews as a proportion of the population of the Russian Empire, where they made up just over 4% of the population as of 1897. The leadership of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, depending on which year you look at it and how you define that term, was made up of between 8 and 12% Jews. Jews were nowhere near a majority of the communists, as Nazi propaganda would have you believe. What this propaganda also fails to account for is the very real oppression suffered by Jews at the hands of the Tsarist regime. They were denied all civil rights and treated, at best, as second-class citizens. It should not be surprising to anyone that particularly young Jewish men gravitated toward radical egalitarian parties like the communists. It's also worth noting that the Jewish population was overrepresented among the anarchists and other radical egalitarian political movements as well. Hitler, however, in his warped mind, saw evidence of the so-called Jewish Bolshevik plot everywhere. In his 1924 political manifesto, Mein Kampf, or My Struggle, Hitler wrote, speaking of the leadership of the Soviet Union, quote, "Do not forget that these rulers belong to a race which combines, in a rare mixture, bestial cruelty and an inconceivable gift for lying, and which today, more than ever, is conscious of a mission to impose its bloody oppression on the whole world. Do not forget that the international Jew, who completely dominates Russia today, regards Germany not as an ally, but as a state destined to the same fate." End quote. In this way, Hitler made no distinction between his hatred for Jews and his hatred for communism, and his hatred for Jews was unrivaled in world history. He saw his later war on the Soviet Union as the culmination of his crusade against the Jews. While he reserved his most vile venom for Jews, who he saw as the lowest of the low, less than human, the ultranationalist, ultra-racialized ideology that he concocted held the Slavic people of the Soviet Union, Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, and others, to also be subhuman. The Nazis' later treatment of Soviet prisoners of war and Slavic citizens under Nazi occupation would reflect this view. Nazi ideology from the very beginning also called explicitly for the annexation of Eastern Europe and Russia. There, Hitler would find Lebensraum, or living space, for the German people. The basic concept was to destroy the Soviet Union and send German settlers to colonize and Germanize the territory, incorporating it into a greater German Reich. In Mein Kampf, Hitler wrote, quote, "The colossal Russian Empire in the East is ripe for collapse, and the end of Jewish domination in Russia will also be the end of Russia as a state." End quote. When the Nazis came to power in Germany in 1933, Stalin and the other educated leaders of the Soviet Union immediately understood the existential nature of this threat. A huge portion of Stalin's rapid industrialization program that we talked about last week was geared toward building up the military to counter this threat. By 1938, the Red Army was the largest in the world and possessed more tanks and airplanes than all the armies of Europe combined. The quality of these machines, however, was another matter. Stalin also sought to improve relations with the Western democracies in hopes of building an anti-Nazi coalition. These efforts did yield some positive results. For instance, in 1933, the Soviet Union normalized relations with the United States and obtained the release of assets belonging to the Russian imperial government that had been frozen by the United States since the revolution. Other efforts were less successful. An attempt to conclude a mutual assistance pact with Poland was unsuccessful, as the Poles did not trust Stalin. Later history would prove that their distrust was not entirely misplaced. When civil war broke out in Spain in 1936, between the forces of the Republic and the fascist movement of General Francisco Franco, Stalin sent vast sums of money and equipment to the Republican forces, while Nazi Germany did the same for the fascists, who ultimately proved victorious. The Spanish Civil War began to shift Stalin's thinking on allying with the Western democracies in opposition to fascism. Compared to the support for Republicans from the Soviet Union, the Western democracies did either nothing or pathetically little to support them. This caused Stalin to doubt that these countries had the will to oppose the Nazis. That same year, Stalin watched Germany reoccupy the demilitarized Rhineland without a peep from France or the UK. His doubts in the resolve of the West to oppose fascism heightened. Finally, in September 1938, the Munich Agreement marked the pinnacle of Western attempts to avoid war by appeasing Hitler. The British and French signed away Czechoslovakia's Sudetenland, a border region of the country populated mostly by ethnic Germans, to Nazi Germany in return for Hitler's promise that he had no further territorial demands in Europe. Stalin had made an agreement to defend Czechoslovakia from the Nazis, but only if France also pledged to fight. When, in March 1939, the German army marched in and occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia, Britain and France didn't lift a finger. Unwilling to confront the Germans on their own, the Red Army also stood down. Stalin no longer suspected that the Western democracies were unreliable allies. He knew it. That summer, when the Germans reached out to propose a treaty, Stalin was ready to listen. Stalin certainly had not fooled himself into imagining the Nazis as friends, but his overtures to the Western democracies were equally practical. Stalin saw both the Nazis and the West as enemies. The Nazis, with their extreme anti-communism, were perhaps the greater threat, but it had not been so long ago that Britain, France, and the United States had all committed their armies to the destruction of the Bolshevik regime in the Russian Civil War. His entire rise to power within the USSR had been defined by his making alliances with one group of enemies to destroy another, and then turning around and destroying his erstwhile allies. If I were to try and analyze Stalin's thinking in 1939, I would say he probably saw no reason why international politics shouldn't work the same way. Hitler, for his part, by the summer of 1939, had decided to attack Poland. He was willing to risk a war with Britain and France in the process, but he was not yet ready for war with the Soviet Union. Whatever he may have thought of their racial inferiority, Hitler could count. He feared that the sheer numbers could overwhelm him if he were drawn into a two-front war with both the West and the Soviet Union. He therefore sought an accommodation that would neutralize the massive army on his eastern flank. Both sides got things they wanted from the pact. The Germans secured their eastern flank so that they could focus all their forces to the west if indeed Britain and France declared war following the attack on Poland. The Soviets were given a free hand to recover territory in Eastern Europe that had once been part of the Tsar's empire, but had been lost after the revolution. Not just the eastern portion of Poland, but also the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and the portions of Romania known as Bessarabia and northern Bukovina, which today constitute the territory of the country of Moldova. The Soviets would occupy and annex all of these territories in 1940. Both sides probably understood this pact to be a temporary arrangement that bought them time to prepare for the inevitable struggle between communism and fascism. Meanwhile, in the Far East, the Soviets were already clashing with a different power, the Japanese. Histories of the Soviet involvement in World War II don't usually include much, if any, discussion of Japan or the events happening in what would become the Asia-Pacific theater of the war. That is mostly because the Soviet Union did not officially go to war with Japan until August 1945, just before the war came to an official end. However, the fact that the USSR did not go to war with Japan, that is, that Japan did not support its ally, Germany, and attack the USSR simultaneously with Hitler, was itself decisive, and it's worth spending a few minutes to explain why. Japan was one of only a handful of East Asian nations that was never colonized by a European power. This was not for a lack of desire by European powers to colonize Japan, but rather it was a result of Japan's rapid modernization and militarization, which was undertaken specifically to avoid being colonized. Japan essentially transformed from a quasi-medieval, feudal state to a modern, industrialized state in a single generation. Their modernization and industrialization efforts were intended to build a military capable of withstanding and defeating any European power that attempted to impose terms on them. The coming out party of the Japanese military machine was the Russo-Japanese War that we talked about briefly back in episode 2. In 1904-1905, Japan not only held her own against the Russians, but decisively defeated them. Following that war, Japan established herself as the unquestioned colonial master of Korea, and also brought Manchuria into their sphere of influence. In the decades that followed, Japan continued to advance a policy of imperial expansion on the Asian mainland, an aspiration that brought them into direct conflict with the Soviet Union. Japanese efforts to seize part of the Russian Far East for their empire were thwarted by the presence of American troops during their joint intervention in the Russian Civil War. The Americans were already a rival naval power in the Pacific, and did not want to see Japan further empowered in the region. By the late 1930s, Japan was already at war with China. Indeed, Chinese historians date the start of the Second World War not to the German invasion of Poland, as is conventional in Western histories, but rather to the 1937 invasion of their own country by Japan. At the same time they were invading and occupying large swaths of China, the Japanese military clashed in minor skirmishes with Soviet forces along their border with Manchuria. The first battle between the Soviets and Japanese happened in 1938 at the Battle of Lake Hassan, when Japanese forces crossed into Soviet territory based on the belief that the Soviets were misinterpreting the line of demarcation. The battle resulted in a tactical draw and strategic Soviet victory, but was seen as a humiliating defeat because the vastly superior Soviet force had suffered 3 times as many casualties and failed to defeat a relatively small Japanese force. The dispute was resolved diplomatically, but the Japanese were emboldened. The following summer, Japanese forces were drawn into a border clash with the People's Republic of Mongolia, a Soviet satellite state with whom the Soviet Union had signed a mutual defense treaty. The clash soon spun out of control as Japanese and Soviet troops were drawn into direct conflict once again. The Japanese sent an army of 30,000 men into the area, hoping to overwhelm the Mongolians and set up strong defensive positions in anticipation of a Soviet counterattack. Stalin sent one of his most promising commanders, the still relatively young, at 43, Georgy Zhukov, to lead the Soviet response. The purges of the army in the 1930s had decimated the Red Army's effectiveness by depriving it of its experienced senior officer corps. However, in some cases, this opened the door for younger, talented officers to rise through the ranks much faster than they otherwise would have been able to. One such officer was Georgy Zhukov. Conscripted into the Tsar's army in 1915, Zhukov had served as a cavalryman in World War I. He was twice wounded and decorated for gallantry, which led to his promotion into the ranks of non-commissioned officers in the Tsar's army. Shortly after the October Revolution of 1917, the young Zhukov joined the Communist Party. He was commissioned as a junior officer in the brand new Red Army, and he served with distinction in the Russian Civil War. Stalin's purges of the Red Army leadership in 1937-38 allowed Zhukov to rise quickly through the ranks, though at one point he only narrowly avoided being purged himself. In the summer of 1939, he was given command of a combined Soviet-Mongolian army of about 70,000 men, including about 500 tanks. Though the Japanese were outnumbered more than 2-1, they were confident. They had held their own against longer odds the previous summer at Lake Khasan, but the Soviet commander at Lake Khasan was not Zhukov. Zhukov used his tanks in a way that the Japanese had never seen and were not expecting. Rather than spreading them out and using them to support a broad infantry advance, as tanks had been used to do on the Western Front in World War I, Zhukov massed them together into 2 mass armored columns and quickly broke through Japanese lines and encircled their army. Following their encirclement, the Japanese would fight on stubbornly to the end, but the battle, now known as the Battle of Khalkhin-Gol, was a disaster for them. Of the roughly 30,000 men they had sent into Mongolia, between 17,000 and 20,000 were lost. In the aftermath of this battle, the Japanese signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, and forever remained extremely wary of further conflict with the Soviets. The defeat turned the ambitions of the army from further expansion on the Asian mainland, and the ambitions of the Navy thereafter dominated the government. Their ambitions led south and east, into the Pacific, and conflict with the United States. Back in Europe, in November 1939, a conflict with Finland went very differently. The territory seized in the aftermath of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact had provided the Soviets with an additional territorial buffer between them and Nazi Germany. But the close proximity of the Finnish border to the country's second-largest city, Leningrad, made Stalin nervous. The Soviets made an offer to swap territory with Finland. The Finns would cede some strategic territory near the city of Leningrad to provide a defensible buffer, and the Soviets would cede some territory to Finland along a different part of the border. When Finland rejected this offer, Stalin actually came back with a second offer that demanded much less territory. This second offer actually split the Finnish government. Some thought Stalin's offer reasonable, but others worried that acceding to any territorial demands by the Soviets would embolden Stalin and lead to further follow-up demands in the future. They wanted to draw a firm line in the sand. The doubters in the Finnish government won out. When his second offer was refused, Stalin attacked Finland with a vast army numbered in the hundreds of thousands, including thousands of tanks, artillery, and other heavy equipment, on November 30th, 1939. Stalin expected an easy victory. What he got was a bloody slaughter. In contrast to Zhukov's skilled leadership in the Far East, in Finland the negative effects of the purges were on full display. Incompetent officers repeatedly led the Red Army into tactical blunder after tactical blunder. Even the Finnish troops expressed disbelief at the masses of Soviet troops sent wave after wave into their prepared defenses. The Soviets brought thousands of tanks with them into Finland, but although the Finns possessed virtually no tanks or even anti-tank weapons, the Soviets lost hundreds of their tanks to improvised Molotov cocktails, named by the Finnish soldiers for the Soviet foreign minister, Vyacheslav Molotov. Eventually, the Soviets doubled down and sent even more waves of bodies at the Finnish defenses until the Finns were overwhelmed by sheer numbers and forced to sue for peace in March 1940. It was a tactical victory for the Soviet Union. They gained more territory than they had demanded prior to the war, in all just under 10% of the territory of Finland, but they had suffered roughly 350,000 casualties, compared to about 70,000 by the Finns. They had also exposed the hopeless incompetence of their military leadership and ineffectiveness of their army. The Germans, in particular, took note. The Germans, meanwhile, had no such difficulties. That winter, as thousands of Soviet soldiers were being slaughtered for minimal gains in Finland, the German Wehrmacht was overrunning Denmark and Norway and defeating the Allied expeditionary force sent to stop them. Then, following the spring thaw, they swept into France and the Low Countries of Belgium and Holland. Belgium and Holland were overrun. Then the French army and British expeditionary force walked right into the strategic trap set for them in northern France. The British expeditionary force was cut off and forced to evacuate across the English Channel back to England. The French were outmaneuvered and defeated. Less than 2 months after the offensive began, The French signed a humiliating armistice that knocked them out of the war and left them under German occupation. The British now stood alone against the Nazis, isolated on their island and unable to strike at Hitler in Europe. Hitler had expected Britain, like France, to make peace. When they obstinately refused, even in the face of his relentless bombing campaign, this probably annoyed him. But isolated on their island without allies, they were more of a thorn in his side than a legitimate threat. That fall, high on his victories in the West, Hitler determined to attack the Soviet Union. He wanted to attack them immediately in the fall of 1940, but allowed himself to be persuaded by the German High Command that an attack so soon would be impossible. The invasion was planned for the following year. The disaster of the Winter War in Finland had convinced Hitler that the Red Army, though massive, lacked morale, was poorly led, and could be easily defeated by a massive blitzkrieg campaign like those he launched against Poland and France. He said of the Soviet Union that fall, "We have only to kick in the door, and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." British intelligence, which had operatives inside Hitler's government and knew of the German plans to attack the Soviet Union, attempted to warn Stalin. Stalin refused to believe them, thinking it a ruse to draw the Soviet Union into war against their enemy. Stalin's own spies passed along the information of the coming invasion to him, but were likewise ignored. Even as multiple reports from the Red Army's border reconnaissance units of a massive German troop buildup along the border reached him, Stalin took no action. He was conscious that it was the mobilization of the Tsar's forces that had led Germany to declare war in 1914, and he told those close to him that he did not intend to make the same mistake as Nicholas II. No preparations were made to defend against a German attack, even as a German army of 3 million men, one of the largest ever assembled, massed along the Soviet border in the spring of 1941. The news, tightly controlled by the state, reported none of this to ordinary Soviet citizens, who went about their daily lives blissfully unaware that in the coming days, months, and years, they would face a struggle unmatched by any people in the history of the world. It would not be a fight for Stalin or his regime, nor would it be a fight for a nebulous concept like communism or national honor. The struggle of the Soviet people in World War II was a fight for their very survival. That's everything for today. Thank you for listening. Next week on the History Sphere, the titanic struggle between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union will begin, with the fate of the world hanging in the balance. As always, I'd like to give a big thank you and shout out to the Blake Annex for providing me with the space I'm using to record this podcast. The History Sphere's website is now live. You can find us at www.thehistorysphere.com. You can also find us on social media on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and the platform formerly known as Twitter. I encourage you all to join our community and contribute to the conversation. In addition, we've reached the listener threshold where you can now support the podcast if you're listening on Spotify. There is a button on our profile that allows you to support us with a monthly donation. If you don't have Spotify or you prefer to listen elsewhere, you can also support us on Patreon. The link to the Patreon can be found on the website. Thank you all for listening. Have a wonderful day.